Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight is another book review, and I'm very excited to talk about this book tonight. I have had it for quite a bit, but I have been putting off reviewing it, and now is the time. So if you've already seen the thumbnail and read the description, then you know what book that we'll be talking about tonight. But if you haven't, this is the book. It is Down the Hill, My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi by Susan Hendricks. And I actually picked this book up way back at CrimeCon in Orlando. And I was actually very lucky enough to meet Susan as well. So not only that, there was also a panel that she did, and I did sit in on that too. So it just kind of gave this book a little bit more of that personal connection because I got to meet her at CrimeCon as well as sit in on one of her panels. And which were both very just phenomenal and really, really emotional. So yes, I'm very excited to talk about this. And especially now, since this case has been in the news quite a bit lately, I think it will be a good time to kind of talk about it, especially, again, where we kind of know where the book ends, even though when the book finished, the trial hadn't started yet. But we will get into that. So before I jump into that, let's just see who's here. Hi, Tony Stewart. Welcome. Oh, that's awesome that this case has drawn a lot of people interested in it. And it's so interesting because I forget where I heard it. I'm sure it was at CrimeCon, but I'd never heard of Delphi, Indiana before. And now when people say Delphi, there's that connotation to this case, which is just so unfortunate. But yeah, this case has gotten a lot of people interested as well. Capone, what is this? A Lauryn Hill? You're so bad. You are so bad. Hi, PJ. Welcome. Mr. Beckham, you must not have a lot going on if you're in my chat when you're not on screen with me. Good to see you, hon. I always get hungry when Danny comes on. Well, you know what? Consider it like you're just sit out, kind of veg out, relax, have some dinner or whatnot. And yeah, let's just chat about the book. The cats are doing great. They are doing great. Yeah, they're all 6 of them are doing wonderful. Thank you for asking. Oh my gosh, Capone, you are horrible. Capone, you are horrible. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this book. So the back has a bunch of reviews of the book, and there's some very notable names on here, like Vinnie Politan and Paul Holes. But if you open the cover here, that is where you get the description of what the book is about. Again, I did type it out just so I could read it a little more easily. So what the book initially describes it will be about, if you just kind of read the cover for that, is former CNN and HLN anchor and veteran broadcast journalist Susan Hendricks takes you inside the double homicide investigation of 2 teens in Delphi, Indiana, and its lasting impact on the community and the nation. On February 13th, 2017, 13-year-old Abigail Williams and her best friend, 14-year-old Liberty German, decided to enjoy a day off from school by exploring the popular hiking trails near the Monon High Bridge in Delphi, Indiana. Less than 24 hours later, their bodies were found on the north bank of Deer Creek, about a mile from where they were last seen. The citizens of Delphi were devastated and replaced their porch lights with orange bulbs, vowing to keep them lit until the murders were solved. In the days and weeks that followed, authorities shared a sketch of the suspect as well as digital remnants of an unsettling encounter that the girls had with a stranger hours before their disappearance, which Libby recorded on her cell phone as it unfolded. Despite the release of this evidence, law enforcement remained tight-lipped about developments in the case, and the public grew restless until the long-awaited suspect was finally arrested in October 2022. Longtime news anchor and broadcast journalist Susan Hendricks was one of the first reporters to cover the case both in the studio and on location. As the investigation stalled, Hendricks found herself drawn back to the town of Delphi, and over the next few years, she built strong relationships with the girls' families, as well as law enforcement officers, criminal experts, and armchair detectives alike, who were determined to get justice for Abby and Libby. In Down the Hill, Hendricks chronicles her pursuit of the truth, featuring exclusive insights and interviews with the people at the heart of the story. As she digs deeper into the mystery, she also explores the rippling impact this case has had, not just in Delphi, but at the very heart of the American heartland. Thoroughly researched and breathtakingly intimate, Down the Hill is a page-turning testament to compassion, connection, and the resilience of the human spirit. A haunting yet heartfelt tale that will leave you forever changed. So I will say that description of the book, it covers a lot. It covers a lot, but is also completely spot on. In regards to Susan referencing kind of her professional aspect with covering this case, as well as the personal ties she then developed with the case, that to me was the biggest takeaway from this book. And I'll get a little bit more into that as I continue on with the review of the book. But that to me really, really stood out, because it's one thing to write it on a page, and it's another thing for the reader to feel it and feel that it's genuine. And that's a hard thing to do. And Susan nailed it, like nailed it. I can't even say enough about it. It was just, you really, really feel her connection. And you feel, again, as the book goes on, you feel kind of where the shift from just and when I say just I don't mean it in a diminishing way, but a journalist who's covering this case and then, meeting the families, the relationships are developing. They're growing over time as people are waiting for justice in this case. You see that shift throughout the entire book, and you feel it. You genuinely feel it as you read it. And again, hats off to Susan for that, because it really, as a reader, you completely just strike right where it needs to be, with the reader feeling what you're saying. Because again, that doesn't always happen. So that was for me the biggest takeaway in this, in regards to the description of the book. So the book itself is, I'm not sure quite how it looks a little bit smaller on camera, but it's pretty decently big. It's 269 pages, and there are 16 pages of photos, and they are color photos, which is always a good thing. And the photos in here are really good quality photos. Like, you can see some of the photos with Susan, as well as some of the families and of the bridge. Again, these are, in regards to a true crime book, these are probably one of the best books with the best quality photos, color photos, that I have seen in quite a while. So that is definitely worth, you get more out of these photos than I think than you would with other books. And again, very good quality photos. I see a few people just kind of bouncing in the chat. Yeah, feel free to, if you guys have any questions as I'm going through this book, by all means, please let me know and we'll kind of go from there. So the foreword in the book is by Kelsey. So it's by Kelsey German. So as we know, Kelsey's sister is one of the victims in this case. And the foreword by her is really, really emotional as well, to the point where I'd read the foreword, and before I even started on chapter 1, I was like, oh my gosh, like my heart was really, really touched by it. Just, oh my gosh, Kelsey's words were just absolutely, they're so raw and so vulnerable. And you feel that again, as a reader, you feel that in this book. I won't necessarily do any quotations from it because it wouldn't be doing it justice by any means, but it's several pages and it's absolutely, absolutely beautiful to read. Hi, Tony Stewart. Welcome. Can I ask how much was the book? Hardcover, more expensive? I don't know let me see. I bought it at CrimeCon. So, okay. Well, the inside cover says US $29, but then Canada 37. But check Amazon, check Goodreads. There's a lot of really good good bookstores where you might be able to get it at a discount. Honestly, though, worth every penny. Worth every penny. So yeah, definitely check that out. I hope you get it, Tony. If so, message me and we will talk about this book. We will absolutely talk about it. So Kelsey, for those who don't know, she is Libby's sister. She talks about in the foreword her and Libby's kind of relationship. And she says how Libby was always her constant. It was them against the world. Kelsey was just 17 when Libby and Libby's friend Abby were murdered. She had no idea how to cope with such a traumatic loss. Not that at any age it would be easy to cope with something like that, but especially at such a young age, losing your sister. Again, she was just 17 years old when this happened. Kelsey talks about what life has been like since February 13th, 2017. She has been able to see the best and also the worst in humanity. And there are so many people who have stood by their family side. And she made sure to mention, as best she could in regards to who has been there for their family. And that was really touching. She also took a moment in her foreword to talk about the author, Susan Hendricks. She talks about meeting her and the friendship that they formed when Susan was covering this case, as well as the friendship that has remained. And that's just so, you feel that throughout the book, the genuine friendship that they formed, that you feel like this is just very clearly just a lifelong connection now and a lifelong friendship that they're going to have going forward. And it's just whenever there is loss, whenever there is tragedy of any kind, like Kelsey says, you see the worst in humanity, but you also see the best. There are, she would love her sister here, and I'm sure never to have been in this position to have met the people that she has. But with that being said, you like gaining that friendship with Susan, and I'm sure Susan would feel the same, gaining that relationship with Kelsey is just one of those unplanned, but really just genuine, worthwhile connections that grew from this. So that was, again, just really, for me, really touching and emotional to read, because again, Kelsey's whole forward that she put in the book was just so genuinely raw and vulnerable. Let's see. I was just curious. You probably have a gold mine box. I know some people, people collect different things. Yeah. And I have a book hutch downstairs full of books. Oh my God, I'm just a book nerd. But you already know that. So now that I've described the cover of the book and the foreword, let's dive into the book itself. So the book starts right away on February 13th, 2017. And Susan at first writes it from Kelsey's point of view of waking up that day. Libby and Abby wanting to go to the local trails, and the plans were made that Kelsey would drop them off, and then a different parent would come and pick them up. So she talks about how on the ride there, the band 21 Pilots, the song Heathens was playing on the radio as she drove the girls. And she dropped them off specifically at the time of 1:49 p.m. The book then switches to the viewpoint of Susan, the author writing this book. She gives little facts that we do know about what we know happened to the girls when they were in the Delphi kind of Indiana trails. But then also there's a lot of kind of guesswork based on, the best guesstimate based on what we know might have happened. But she does a really good job, Susan, of saying, this is what we do know. Then this is what most likely happened based on the little bits and pieces that we've learned. After about 3 p.m., Derek, Libby's father, arrives to pick them up. He couldn't reach them, couldn't find them. So family, friends in the community, and of course, law enforcement came to help join to find the girls. The next day, the search for the girls continued, and at 2:00 p.m., officials announced that they found the bodies of 2 young girls discovered along the trails. And then 24 hours later, the bodies were identified as Abby and Libby. Susan writes about how she was on the set at CNN in Atlanta when the details about this case first started to emerge. And here is where Susan talks about her history at CNN and her career history, what she did at CNN. And that was very interesting to learn because I had no idea what it was like from kind of her professional experience in regards to talking about this case. I will say for all of the true crime books I read, that was something that had never really come up in any of the books that I read. And I'm like, as I was reading it, I was absolutely fascinated. Then also like, how have I never read about this? How do I not know that this is how kind of in that profession, how this works? So again, that to me was one of the interesting parts of this book because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm learning something new that I had no idea about. She talks about how the job moves fast, very, very fast. Once you turn your mic off, you hear, all clear from the producer, and then you're on to the next story or the next assignment. So you don't really have the time to kind of stop and think. You're just, one job to the next, to the next, to the next. And as the news was breaking about this case, everyone, not just the Delphi community, but the media and those learning about this case, everybody hoped that it would be solved immediately. Susan, when this kind of first started breaking, she had interviewed Ron Logan on air, and she describes this interview and what Ron was talking about in the interview. He describes the area and that his son spent a lot of time on those same trails that Abby and Libby were on. Meanwhile, we also learn about, from Susan's perspective, as a reporting on this, what was going on with the families and what was kind of going on with their end in regards to what they were learning, the little bit of information that was being released versus what they still didn't know and what they were hoping to learn about what happened to their daughters. And we hear also about law enforcement at that time, what they were reporting and what they weren't reporting, mostly because they just didn't know. The book goes to the February 15th press conference where it announced the identities of those 2 girls that were found. And of course, they were identified as Abby and Libby. Later that evening, the police released a grainy photo of a man, a possible witness. It was clear whoever did this was familiar with the area. The killer was one of them. And the book gets a little bit more specific into why, because when you hear about the bridge and the area that the girls were, this wasn't an area that somebody an outsider just maybe pulled to the side of the road and stumbled upon. It was not like this. It was very clear that whoever did this knew the area, was comfortable with the area. And I know a lot of what I'm talking about right now, as the trial has already occurred, a lot of you guys are probably like, well, yeah, we know that now. But I'm kind of might be relating some of the details again, kind of in the order of how Susan writes the book out. Because again, at this time, the trial had happened. So just kind of be mindful of that. Is my internet being shoddy? It might be, and my apologies if it is. It was me probably those. Oh, okay. But honestly, yeah, the internet here has not been great lately. So if I was, then yeah, sorry, nothing much I can do. So again, it was clear whoever did this was from that area. And how scary is that? How scary is that? Kelsey described the first couple of days and first couple of weeks after the discovery of the girls in regards to, again, this was her sister that was murdered. So again, with law enforcement not having a lot of detail at the time, what it was like from her perspective. Again, written, it's still from Susan's perspective, but she's describing how Kelsey is relating it. On February 22nd, 2017, there was a press conference where the voice of an encounter with a stranger was played. Libby had started recording the interaction on her phone, which was tucked away in her pocket. And this was the press conference where everybody first heard down the hill. After this audio was released, people expected an arrest real soon, but nothing came. So July 17th, 2017, a sketch of a potential suspect was released. The sketch was of a middle-aged man, possibly an older man, scruffy in appearance, slightly heavyset, and wearing a hoodie. February 9th, 2019, Susan was heading to Delphi to meet with the family. So she was heading there with a few members of her team in regards to reporting on this case. And this is where she met Kelsey and Libby's family in their home. Kelsey's family in their home. So she goes into a lot of detail about meeting the family and being honestly just so, and you can tell, just so graciously welcome into their home. And that was really touching to see. And there was just a lot of emotion, some of it more kind of happy times, some of it a little bit more solemn, but it was just really clear how welcoming Libby's family was. And reading it, before you kind of hear about the connection that Kelsey and Susan made, as the book is like, you pick up that vibe. It's just like, there was just something there, that there was just like a connection and a bond that was forming between the two of them. And that was just really heartwarming to read, because again, you feel it and then you see it blossom as the book goes on. Hi, Virginia Wolf. Good to see you. Yeah, the video that was released. Well, right now the video hasn't been released per se, but the audio has. So, but yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So again, Susan goes into detail about meeting the family, seeing the home. There was a lot of pictures of Libby framed in the house. She was given a little bit of a tour from the family in regards to the area of Delphi, its history, as well as she got to go firsthand and see the trails for herself, where Abby and Libby were the day they went missing and were ultimately found murdered. And Kelsey gave her that tour of the Monon High Bridge. And for those of us who, like myself, have never been to Delphi, Indiana, you see pictures of the bridge, and it's very different for me, for seeing what people who have been there have described it. And when I kind of mean a little bit more people who aren't from there, maybe outsiders from Delphi, if you will, just how scary it is, how structurally unsafe it is. And I think that says a lot because, as Wolf had mentioned in regards to the video, bridge guy is kind of walking across, hand in pockets. But when you see kind of the footing of where you would be stepping on the bridge, it's like, wait, like I would be like hands out, like ready, bracing myself if I fell. And for somebody to walk across it just so cool, calm, and collected with their hands in their pockets, I think just really goes to show whoever did this was from there. They were very familiar with that bridge. So that's just something to make note of. And Susan talks about her kind of firsthand experience seeing the area there, seeing the bridge. I know other people who have reported about this case and have, written books about this case have also talked about that same thing as well. And that's interesting how it's a similar consistency from everybody who has touched upon that and seen it. Hi, Zach. Welcome. Let's see. So one thing about this case that bothers me is the day the two girls, Abby and Libby, were there and the killer, was it by accident or pre-planned from the chat on the internet? I know that's one of the questions that as we've talked about this kind of on the True Crime and Chill on Friday nights, that was, what you put right there is definitely, one of the questions that has always kind of been there. Obviously, in regards to the trial, if that was kind of answered in itself, but there are some people that are just like feel one way or another, regardless, in regards to was it planned or was it a crime of opportunity? Let's see. Capone is saying, what do you think about the connection between the guy who was grooming them? Do you think he set them up? Keegan, was it brought up in the trial? Sorry, I'm just double checking the comments. I don't want to miss anything. Well, in regards to, Tony, in regards to him, which bridge guy, Richard Allen, in regards to why, him being there, the timing it was of him being there. So it would lead to a crime of opportunity. But there are so many people that still lead to, was it a planned, in regards to those girls being there that day, that time. I don't buy that. I think it was very much a crime of opportunity and they were just there. But if you read the book, you'll find out a little bit more because the book does touch upon Richard Allen at the end, but we'll get there. So jumping a little bit ahead, but I just wanted to make sure I acknowledged your question. Because that is that's one of those questions that a lot of people even still have. So, okay. So yes, when Susan and her crew were there, they filmed at the location, the Monon High Bridge, for the news. After they left to go back to the hotel they were staying at, and then to the airport to head home. Now the book jumps ahead 2 months forward. There was a news press conference about the case. Something was happening. Something big was about to happen. CNN wanted Susan to be there, to be in Delphi. So she did fly out there to go. And in the book, Susan discussed calling Joseph Scott Morgan, wanting to talk to an expert, even though there was limited information so far. Y'all know I'm a big Joseph Scott Morgan fan. The podcast Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan, I have talked about it before. Amazing podcast. He is so incredibly knowledgeable. So when I got to see and read about the connection in the book with Susan and Joseph Scott Morgan, I was like, oh, thank God. Like, oh, yes. That made my heart so happy reading that because I'm a big Joseph Scott Morgan fan, as I've just said multiple times. And he's just so knowledgeable. So any insight that he can provide, I really take to heart. And I think y'all should too. So reading that in the book was just like, all right, here's an expert, but an expert that I trust their opinion on. So April 19th, 2019, press conference. So law enforcement was needing more information from the public. They were needing information on the driver of a vehicle that was parked at the old CPS DCS welfare building. Additionally, portions of the audio recording were also now being released. This, as Wolf posted earlier, this is where they released the video of the suspect walking across the bridge. And now, however, they were also releasing a new sketch of the suspect. And Susan goes into a lot of detail about how shocking that was, the new suspect drawn to the community, to the media, to the families, because the second sketch looked completely different than the first. The families, since this happened, every day were making it a point to distribute that first sketch. Please, somebody must recognize this man. Please come forward. Do you know who this is? Doing all of that work. And now, all these months later, to be at another press conference in here, completely disregard that. Here's a new sketch. I can't even imagine. But Susan does an excellent job in describing, again, the reactions of everybody, especially the reactions of the families. Hi, Brian. Welcome. Good to see you. Let's see. I want to make sure I keep up with you guys in regards to any questions or comments on this. From what I read, all right, even admitted that he had a gun on him. What was the name of the first guy? Not Richard Allen. Ron Logan? Is that the one that you're thinking? There will be other suspects, and the book does get into that. So I'm sure your question will be answered shortly if I did not already answer it. So stay tuned, Tony. So Susan then goes into a bit more detail about the book into Abby herself. And there's a lot of information that she provides that the reader really takes away, that like almost like a sense of, wow, I know her. I now know so much about her. And a lot of this she got to learn through Abby's family. And it's very interesting because I followed the case since the very beginning online, and on any news reports that was on TV and whatnot, any news articles. And yes, they talked about the girls and like a little bit about the girls, but it's one thing to kind of hear that and say, oh, okay, that's a little bit about Abby, that's a little bit about Libby. But I didn't get a sense of knowing them, honestly, until I read this book, because the way Susan describes them, it's not just giving like a kind of more fact-based biographical background where it's just like she was born on this day, and where it's just very matter of fact and straightforward. The way it's written, I don't know. Susan has honestly just a way of every single page not only is fact-based, but very, very emotionally written, where it really just reaches myself as a reader in a way that a lot of other true crime books don't. And it's interesting that I felt that connection and that sense throughout the entire book. I don't get that with a lot of true crime books. There'll be emotional parts where all of a sudden, you're really pulled in and really just mentally there in the moment. And then, it kind of fades off and so on and so forth. Not this book. You feel it every single page all the way through. And yeah, I can't say enough good things about it. But again, it just makes you, especially when she's talking about Abby or talking about Libby, you flip the page and you have that sense of like, wow, I feel like I knew them. And you don't get that. I haven't gotten that with a lot of other books about this case, but I got that with this. So I wanted to make a special note of that. So now we are at a little over 4 years after the murders. And Susan was on stage in Austin, Texas with Becky, Kelsey, and Tara, all Libby's family. and a large crowd had gathered to hear their story. They, as in the family, used Facebook as a tool, both to communicate their grief and to communicate with Libby directly. And the book goes kind of into some examples in a chronological order of how they were using it in regards to communicate with Libby directly. One of the examples is a post that Becky wrote on June 9th, 2017. Just even something simple as, quote, "sure do miss you," end quote. And Tara, every single day, was posting, quote, "today is the day," end quote. And we've heard, if you've been following this case, you know Tara's posts that today is the day, every single day. But to kind of go back in time and read this as Susan is describing, as the case was unfolding, as she was writing this book, it was just kind of like, oh, wow, 4 years later, and here we still are. Today is the day. So Susan was talking about how each time now she had to report updates on the case, she felt different about it, because now it wasn't just a case that was, she had to give that news update, and now, you get the all clear in your ear from producers, so you move on to the next and you don't have the time to think about it. Remember how we talked about that earlier, how Susan talked about it? Now it was different. She had a connection with the families, but not just a connection, a relationship now, a friendship with them. So it just hit a little differently. And I do remember when this was being broadcast across the news, and again with CNN, listening to Susan and seeing her talk about it directly. And I do remember that. And I didn't pick up at the time of watching her report about this, kind of that sense of, that relationship with the family, because, I just saw it on TV or, online, and it just seemed very, I hate to say professional because that's what it's supposed to be, but I didn't pick up on anything more than that. Not that I should have, but it was very straightforward. And I just I'm thinking, how could, that's her job, but I'm thinking, oh my gosh, inside it was so much more than that. And yet she had to keep that professional, front forward. And I can't even imagine, after getting so close to it, what that must have been like. She describes it, but I'm just I don't get how she was so good at just kind of putting that aside to be able to report on it and then be able to I don't know. It's just one of those heartbreaking things where she was able to very eloquently and professionally give updates on the case anytime there was those little updates on the case. So Detective Jerry Holman, so he reached out to Susan. He was in Delphi working the case. And Susan had learned that Libby had recorded more on her phone than was being released to the media. And this makes sense. And that's one of the things Susan talks about in the book, is if they release everything, that could ultimately lead to false confessions. So Susan then goes on to talk about the media and the community's response to when the audio of Bridge Guy saying "down the hill" was released, and her interviews discussing all of this. We all remember, if you were following this case, and even if you weren't, I'm sure you heard this and you're like, what is this "down the hill" Bridge Guy? What is that? But we all remember the internet just going wild over it, because again, especially, you're seeing somebody and then you're hearing the voice, you're thinking, oh my gosh, somebody knows who this is. There must be something. Someone will come forward and we're going to get answers very soon. But that didn't necessarily happen. So the FBI was working with the Indiana State Police to try to help solve this case. And one thing I didn't know about this, but Susan put it in the book, and I made a special note on this. There was, on any given day, no less than over a dozen agents working the case there. That was fascinated. I had no idea that there was that many behind the scenes working that. Susan would go on to talk about, now that all of this information in regards to Bridge Guy, Down the Hill, the video, the audio, the now new second sketch, how the victims' families were dealing with this, but also how they were dealing with the media. And within each family, there were a lot of family members dealing with it very, very differently. For example, some family members were willing to be more front and center, speaking to the media, doing any interviews, and others were very much behind the scenes, not wanting to be on camera, which makes sense. Some of the names of the early on suspects were also discussed in this book. I'm just going to name the names, but in the book, Susan goes into detail on each person that I'll mention their names and why each of them was a suspect. So Tony Stewart, I know that you were just asking about that. So if I didn't answer the name already, this might do so. So Daniel Nations, Paul Etter, James Brian Chadwell, and Ron Logan. So just want to double check that I didn't miss any. Oh my gosh, Tony. Okay. All right. Okay. Just making sure I'm caught up. So there was a whole chapter on CrimeCon and the significance of CrimeCon. So this was actually the CrimeCon before the one that I went to where I met Susan. And when it's so interesting because I learned about CrimeCon kind of a little bit later on, but from Susan's perspective, being, in the field, working for CNN and hearing about CrimeCon, it was so interesting for her. She just gives her like genuine first reactions to it. Like she never heard of it. What was it like? Was it like Comic-Con? And Mike from the family had wanted to go and have the families tell their story about Libby and what was going on. But Mike also wanted Susan to go with them to help tell their story. So they all went. Susan discussed what that whole experience was like and from the perspective of Libby's family. And it was interesting because Susan was talking about how, in regards to going on stage and talking in front of this large group of people, how nervous she was and how she was like, I can't do this. And, Libby's family was like, what are you talking about? You're on TV every single night, and just how different that was. And I found that very interesting because, Susan is, if you have not seen her on CNN reporting after this show, go to YouTube and just check it out. She is amazing. So to see that and then hear her or see her write that, she was just like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. Like, I'm so nervous speaking in front of all these people. It was just so like, oh my gosh, like how kind of different she was, a little bit kind of behind and off camera, if you will. And it made me just kind of chuckle and just be like, oh my God, she's just human like the rest of us, just like the rest of us. But I liked that little moment because it's, again, you're reading the book and it's such a heartbreaking book, but those kind of little moments where you can kind of have that, like, kind of take a breath, have that one little chuckle to yourself, and then continue reading. Like, those moments are so important. And I got that moment from Susan there. So Kelsey, in regards to CrimeCon, so Susan relates what that experience was like from Kelsey. She says, quote, CrimeCon is the place where my advocacy started. I don't know where I would be here today if I didn't have that first year in Indiana. That's where I created my support system, end quote. Then the book starts to talk about the negative side of the media and armchair detectives. Again, you get that first kind of wonderful thing that the media and online communities have done for Abby and Libby's family and for law enforcement, any little tips they have to help. But as we know, with any case, there's the negative to it. And Susan writes about that. And it's just, I was just so frustrated reading it because it's just like, what the heck? Like, people are going through the most traumatic time in their life, and they're having to do it on camera, in front of the country, in front of the world, if you will. Everybody can read and see this, and this is the most horrifying, tragic thing that they could ever go through. Their loved one has died and has been murdered. And yet, there's just people behind a keyboard and talking about, pointing the finger specifically at innocent people. And one of the things that we learned about at trial, I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead, was one of the theories that was floating around at trial that Kelsey was involved. I mean, outrageous. In such, like, her sister passed away, and for just people, again, kind of behind the camera, behind a keyboard, like, oh, it must have been you. It must have been you. Like, wild. And even Susan talks about some of the negativity she got from, again, armchair detectives and people commenting online in regards to, oh, she's getting a little too close to the family and things like that. And it's just like, who are you? Like, who are you? But yeah, as I was reading it, like, I felt the frustration because anybody who's, puts themselves out there on a platform in one way or another, you're going to get that. And it was so frustrating because this was a platform that the families didn't ask for. They didn't ask for this. They didn't ask for this. And yet they have to deal with, like, the bullshit of it, which sucks. But that's one of the things I like that Susan put that in the book, because it's such a true part about this. It sucks, but it's such a true part about what the families had to go through. And again, what Susan had to go through being, a reporter in this, what law enforcement got hit really hard as well because of the amount of time that passed in regards to before an arrest was made. And we all, again, it was years before one happened, and people were thinking, oh, there's video, there's audio, this is going to be solved really fast. And it wasn't. So when it didn't happen, people got angry. And again, they got a lot of flack too. But again, as we learned, as Susan had talked about earlier in the book, that they could not release every little thing because it would lead to it could lead to false confessions. And they wanted the person who did this to Abby and Libby to be held accountable. So it's just such a bad position to be in. But let's move past the negativity of that. So in regards to the timeline now of the book, we're at May 17th, 2022. In a podcast that is called The Murder Sheet, obtained a 9-page request from the FBI for a search warrant that revealed new details about the murders. All right, I kind of lied. I said moving on from the negativity. One more thing. Sorry. So this podcast released those documents and information. And that was not good. In response to those documents being released, Superintendent Doug Carter and the FBI had to quickly release statements responding to these leaked documents. There were headlines and online sleuths that went crazy saying, quote, Ron Logan is bridge guy, end quote. The documents released things that said, or people kind of put 2 and 2 together where it necessarily should not have been put together. But again, taking the little bit of information that they had and fitting it for a story, that Ron was responsible for the crimes. It said that law enforcement had searched his property and he was a person of interest. So again, taking that thing and then turning it into, well, he must have done it. If he was a person of interest, he must be the one responsible. And I know we've all learned and heard about Ron Logan being a suspect in this case, but like, oh my gosh, like that podcast getting that like, it's so frustrating. And we see that with so many other cases where it's for what? You're possibly jeopardizing a case for what? So you can say, we got this first, we're going to put it out. Like, that's horrible. Horrible. And I forgot about that. When I read this and got to that part, I was like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that happened. And then I got all angry again reading about it. But all right, now that we are off that part, yeah, that was just shitty thing to do. So Susan then discusses that she appeared with Dr. Oz about this case. Hey, Auntie Mimi, welcome. So this is where the book gets into, and I know you guys were talking about it earlier in the chat, the Instagram account. So Keegan Kline, and the account was at Anthony_shots. And we learned that this account was basically, it was fake, it was catfishing, and then there was this whole, could this account have been connected to this case, to the murder of Abby and Libby? The book goes a lot into this account, Keegan Kline, Anthony_shots. I'll just leave it there. We've all heard about it quite a bit since the case came out, but nonetheless, it does go quite a bit into detail in the book. So October 28th, 2022. So this is where Susan got a text, and the text said, Delphi arrest. Richard Allen had been arrested. So what we then learned, the little bit of information that we had, was he was a local guy. I'll repeat that. He was a local guy and he worked at CBS. No one had really heard of him in regards to, again, any leaked information about persons of interest. When the media learned about Richard, they also learned that he had a daughter. So that made Susan instantly think of Kerri Rawson. So for those of you who have not heard, or you aren't familiar with who Kerri Rawson is, she is Dennis Rader, BTK's daughter. Susan goes on to talk about her relationship that she has with Kerri. They first met at CrimeCon 2021, and she discussed the conversation that they had. And Kerri Rawson is also an author. I have recommended her book before in my book recommendations video. I think it was in like the first video that I did. But nonetheless, if you have not read it, please do so. And I really liked that Susan made that kind of connection in her head to Kerri in regards to hearing that Richard had a daughter. So that was a very interesting tie that when I was reading the book, I didn't expect her to bring in that piece and that connection, but I'm really glad she did, because it was very spot on. So in regards to now that information coming out that there was arrest, and the arrest was of Richard Allen, Susan talks about how she called Becky when she found out. The family remembers Richard, because when Tara went to go get film developed in regards to doing pictures for Libby's casket, Richard was there at the CVS, and he wouldn't let the family pay for those photos. So it was very interesting, because that's a story that we've heard throughout this in regards to following the trial. But again, Susan has that personal connection and relationship with the family. So to have it written with that perspective, it just, again, it gives a level of emotion in the book that I didn't get from any other news outlets when we heard, oh, Richard Allen worked at the CBS. When the family wanted pictures developed, he insisted that they not pay for it, versus how Susan writes it in the book, where it's a lot more, again, with the family's kind of perspective and that emotional backing to it. So we learn next that the press conference was scheduled for October 31st, 2022. Susan was not able to attend this press conference in person, but she did watch it, and she texted Kelsey letting her know that she was watching. And once that information was out, she was ready to share that with the world. During this press conference, that again, it was announced Richard M. Allen of Delphi was arrested on 2 counts of murder. Susan puts that entire conference announcement in this book, word for word, which was really great to be able to, for myself, go back and reread it. And any details that I either missed when it was first announced going back several years ago, or if it was one of those, oh, I forgot that was said. I vaguely remember it, but now, kind of remembering that. She writes about how she then had to prepare for a 8 p.m. show that night where she would be reporting live about the new developments that had occurred in this case. Susan puts that entire announcement as well in the book. And she went on to have law enforcement come on the show with her, as well as several members of the victims' families. Again, a lot of that is in the book as well, so you can read all of that. Immediately after Richard Allen was arrested and taken into custody as a suspect, we read about, and we also learned about how Richard was basically, we didn't know a lot about him, and the media was on a hunt to get as much information about him as they could. Richard at first said he would seek his own legal representation, but then realized he didn't know how expensive it was, so he asked the court for legal representation. The book then goes on from Susan to talk about as much was known about Richard Allen at that time. Again, we've learned so much more because of the trial, but at the time of the writing, Susan put everything that we did know about Richard. And again, the public wanted as much information as they could. And taking a step back, though, Abby and Libby's families were a little bit more reserved. They wanted everything to be done by the books. So Becky, and I totally forgot this until I read the book, Becky created a petition for people to sign to keep the details of the investigation under wraps. And she posted that on Facebook, and a copy of that post is in the book. And that makes sense. As much as we, the public, want information, we're not privy to it. Who are we? And the victims' families are saying, hold on. We want this done right. We want justice for Abby and Libby. And if that means you just have to wait until trial, then just wait until trial. They want the right form of justice in the person who did this to their loved ones to have a fair trial, to ensure everything is done correctly. So, hey, K-Dog, welcome. Just double checking. They couldn't get his gun to replicate the... Oh, okay, you guys are talking a little ahead of me, but that's okay. So Susan then goes on to write about, we talked a little bit about the media and online sleuths and what the victim's family had to go through. But now we're at a different stage. Richard Allen is under arrest. But does that mean the victim's families, in regards to some of the hurtful things that are being posted online, does that mean that stops? No. And Susan addressed that right in the book. And again, it was one of those, just a wave of emotions reading this book. And again, just such, at this point when she talks about it, it was just more, I was just very full of rage reading about it. The accusations, the lies, the hateful posts from, random people online. The families had to deal with this. On the one hand, it's like, okay, somebody's been arrested. Law enforcement has something. There's been an arrest. Let's do what we have to do to go forward so that there's a proper trial to get answers and someone held accountable for who killed our families, who killed someone in our family, who killed Abby, who killed Libby. And then again, this wave of bullshit that the victims' families had to endure. It's just, oh my gosh, I can't even. And I'm really glad Susan puts that in this book because it was such an integral part of it. So she didn't gloss over it and just like, oh, and then there was some, no, she's very, here's what the families had to deal with. And I'm really glad she just put that just straight in there the way she did, because it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. And I really hope people who read this book and who are familiar with this, again, take a step back and just be like, this is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. And, hopefully if you're, we see, and I see with just comments on people's posts where, there is someone saying something, just hurtful lies, accusations, just general hateful posts. And then there's other people that will jump in it and be like, unacceptable, don't do that. Be one of those people that say that is unacceptable. Be one of those better people. So just my little soapbox moment there. But yeah, I'm glad Susan put that in there because, yeah, it had to be said. So again, Richard Allen is arrested. The book then talks about the back and forth in regards to the prosecution and then defense, in regards to being in court prior to the actual trial starting. And quote, when Susan and the public learned that Richard Allen inserted himself into the investigation by telling a law enforcement officer that he was on the bridge that day. So that was an interesting part. So, oh, sorry, that wasn't the quote. That was just a little star in my end with the notes. Sorry. But yeah, that's one of the things that we hear and is very common with true crime. People inserting themselves in the case. And that was no different. And Susan talks about, again, not just the public, but herself learning that Richard Allen inserted himself. But the thing with that is no one followed up with him as a suspect. So that was just one of those moments where it's like, oh my God, he puts himself there, but he was cleared. No one really. So Susan reached out to Paul Holes about this. And I mentioned Paul Holes earlier. He gave a very, very good review about the book on the back and recommendation for the book. And he has given a lot of information kind of about what his sense is about this. And Susan actually gives an entire chapter in this book to her conversation with Paul Holes. And that was a fascinating read. I can't even begin to sum it up, but it's really, really good. There's also an entire chapter on Dr. Ann Burgess. And I am such a Dr. Ann Burgess fan. Like, oh my gosh, love her, love her, love her. And I was very, very fortunate to meet her, I think, was it last year, at a book signing. But Susan not only talks about Dr. Ann Burgess in regards to her conversations about the case with her, but also gives a bit of a background into Dr. Ann Burgess and all of her experience in the field, which Susan did an excellent job in doing that and condensing it to a chapter because, oh my gosh, Dr. Ann Burgess, someone could write like 10 books on her career and it still wouldn't be enough to do her justice. But Susan did a really good job of fitting that all into one chapter. I will say that. So great job on that. The last chapter in the book is what will happen next in the case. And the trial is about to start. So that is where the book ends, down the hill. So again, Down the Hill, My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi by Susan Hendricks. A must read. I very, very much recommend this book. I know as I was talking about the book with you guys, I gave you what my takeaways were from it. In regards to this case, there are a lot of books about this case. This one is a really great one because it's written by someone who is, boots on the ground, reporting about this case from day one. So somebody who is, again, in this field in regards to reporting on any and all true crime that breaks, Susan is there. So you get her professional kind of background with this book, but then you get how it ties into regards to her, connections, interactions, and then ultimately friendships with the victims' families. So this book just gives that really professional, personal balance in perspective that you're not going to get anywhere else. You're not going to get that anywhere else in talking about this book. And Kelsey, again, her forward in the book, so emotional, so vulnerable, so open, so raw. Just, again, before you even get into chapter 1, you get that, and your heart is already just, oh my God, just there. There was, I hate to say I would have liked more from Kelsey, because again, it was just a forward in the book. I was just, every sentence that I read, I was just like on the edge of my seat, just like feeling what she was saying, and being in the moment of reading that, I just wanted her to keep going. I wanted her just to not stop. I just wanted her to talk for, whether it was for 5 minutes or 5 hours, just talk about Libby, talk about Abby, talk about your family, yourself, everything you've experienced. I wanted that. And that's just a side note. I mean, Kelsey could put out a whole book in herself, and I would just be so drawn to like every sentence just hanging on her every word, because, oh my gosh, it was just written so beautifully, so beautifully. But yeah, those were just the big takeaways for me. And then also, like I said, hearing about Susan in regards to reporting on this case from her perspective, because it's so, think about how many news reports that we watch anytime there's, breaking true crime news or any type of news. And you don't know what goes on like from that behind the scenes. But for Susan to describe it, I was just like fascinated reading about that, just absolutely fascinated. So that was, for me, another takeaway from it was like, oh, I'm learning something new. So yeah, any last minute questions or comments from y'all in the chat about the book? I hope it is a comment of purchasing now. You will not regret. Such a great book. Zach says, right on. Thank you, Zach. Royce, hi, Royce. Long time no see. Hope you're doing well, hun. K-Dog, one of the prosecutors was found liable in another case of fabricating. Coming from where I am right now in Massachusetts in regards to, we won't get into it right now, the Karen Reed trial. Yeah. It's just, when you hear stuff like that. I did not hear that myself. I didn't read that myself, but thank you for saying that. Did not know. Tony Tanny, with all due respect, Susan on one side of the coin. What about the defense and the other side? Two sides on criminal cases. That is fair. That is completely fair. I wouldn't necessarily focus it in regards to, see, my one disagreement on that comment is in regards to, there isn't the perspective of her being on like the prosecution side. There isn't that tone in the book at all, like at all. It's more of her in regards to reporting on what was breaking, at each point in time, and her connection with the family. So that's more so where the book is, not in regards to Susan advocating for the state, advocating for the prosecution. It was more so her in her relationship with the family as everything was kind of being released. But you do make a good point in regards to there are so many books that do have that kind of, you're either on the prosecution side or the defense side. But I will say with this one, it wasn't that. It was more so her in the relationship with the families. After this, I have a better understanding why parents don't let their kids outside like they did when we were kids. Oh, yeah. Well said. Well said. And we hear that. Well, I just want to expand on that because it doesn't matter where you live now. I feel like in regards to, again, I'm from Massachusetts, Boston area. So it's very different in regards to go outside and play versus maybe, again, Delphi, Indiana. Very, very different. And where a community where people know everybody, it's still most likely that's okay to go out and play. But then when you hear so often, crimes like this happen in New York City, crimes like this happen in LA. It doesn't happen here, insert name of small town. You hear that all the time. And sadly, that's all it takes is for all of us to kind of sit back and be like, if it happens there, it can really happen anywhere. But you're absolutely right, Wolf. Yeah, that's what, since the trial has occurred, there's a whole thing with, that's kind of gone on with that. Good point. Danny seems more commonplace than ever. Look up sex offender registry. Oh, I've said this before, unless you've been through a criminal case and been sent to an institution to do time, you only have a narrow view of the crime, one-sided view. Tony, that is a fair point. That is an absolutely fair point. Okay. I want to just put that on just as a quick reminder. But all right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for another book review. Again, go and purchase this. I definitely recommend it. Down the Hill, My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi by Susan Hendricks. An excellent, excellent read on the case. Later in the week will be the weekly True Crime and Chill. So join me later for that. Next week will be the very first meeting of the Danny After Dark book club. And that will be live, where we will be reviewing the Truman Capote book. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So if you want to be a part of that, definitely let me know if you have not already. And I would love y'all, to as many people as possible, to be part of it. Even if you're just watching and kind of hanging out in the chat, or just kind of sticking back and watching to hear what those of us who have read it, who want to be on camera to talk about it, will say. So stay tuned for that. That will be next week. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your evening. Oh, it's getting late, Great rest of your evening, great rest of your week. See you later on. And remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everybody.